Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our final keynote speaker, I'd like to first offer a round of congratulations. This year's organizers are continuing a trend of complete conferences that are hardly restricted to academic papers, and that expands the idea of academic conference to include communal theater going, film screenings, and concerts featuring Renaissance instruments. So let's give the conference committee a hearty round of applause. It is my minor ecstasy to introduce Professor John Paul Ricco. Professor John Paul Ricco is an art historian and queer theorist whose interdisciplinary research, teaching, and writing draw connections between late 20th century and contemporary art and architecture, continental philosophy, and issues of gender and sexuality, bodies and pleasures, pornography, and eroticism. He is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art, Media Theory, and Culture in the Department of Visual Studies, and Graduate Professor in the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. He is the author of The Logic of the Lure, University of Chicago 2003, and The Decision Between Us, Art and Ethics in the Time of Scenes, University of Chicago 2014. Serendipitously, this conference features a lineage of three. W.J.T. Mitchell was Professor Ricco's supervisor at the University of Chicago, and Professor Ricco will speak on the work by the artist Francisco Fernando Granados, who may or may not be here in the audience. And I say may or may not be here because if you have any questions surrounding his work in the Q&A period, he and I both want you to ask them boldly as though he were not in the room. So, I first met Professor Ricco after learning that he and I were rabid Blanchot fanboys. And he agreed to meet me for lunch in Toronto's LGBT village. We spoke for hours about Blanchot's book, The Writing of the Disaster, intimacy and its enemies in academic settings, and the history of queer cruising. All the while, we were enjoying a dish of beef cheeks, carefully prepared and exquisitely creamy. Apologies to vegetarians in the audience. As I got to know his work better through his public lectures, the cheeky symbolism of the experience of speaking to Professor Ricco over beef cheeks has stayed with me. Professor Ricco's work is deeply concerned with abstractions and deconstructions of speech, and its supplement, the writing act. But it always attends to materiality, the vitality of partial objects, and the communality of queerness. And he engages with embodiment fiercely through the channels of contemporary art, theory, and film. In today's lecture, he will range over the forms of the face and the portrait, in drawing the figure of the edge, and its undecidable zones of interiority and exteriority. Delivering a paper entitled Edging, Drawing, the Common, please join me in welcoming Professor John Paul Ricco.
Thank you. Thank you, Fan, for that introduction. It's such an honor to be asked by the graduate students in comparative literature to be one of the keynote speakers, and it's certainly an honor as well to be presenting with my eminent colleagues, Linda and Michael Hutchin, and to share the podium with my former supervisor and long-term friend, Tom Mitchell. As was true back then when we were in Chicago together, the same is true today. None of this is his fault. In my work over the past 25 years, I've theorized aesthetic and erotic logics of attraction, decision, departure, and abandonment, and have examined images, objects, and scenes in which the risks and pleasures of the social, that is, of being with and in common, take place. Historically and geographically situated in late 20th century and contemporary North America and Europe, this work has been interested in drawing out the political and ethical implications and prospects of non-normative, queer, and at times even more clandestine forms of sociality and sexuality. Specifically, forms and spaces, acts and gestures that are prior to, or that exist in the wake of, social identities, otherwise plotted along a spectrum from the individual subject to the collective community. In all of this work, I have asked the question about what it means to share in a sense of the common that is neither based upon nor that seeks a common ground of knowledge, but rather happens in the anonymity of itinerancy and promiscuity, in being attracted to the imperceptible, and in the incessant exposure to disappearance. In other words, what it might mean to substitute something like a cruising ground for an epistemological ground. Which is also to ask, with Jean-Luc Nancy, quote, whether being together can do without a figure, and as a result, without an identification, if the whole of its substance consists only in its spacing. Based upon the Derridian idiom from which it is derived, the term spacing means the opening of exteriority as such, the opening to or towards the outside, where outside, in turn, is understood not in the sense of a transcendent beyond, and where to or toward indicates a direction and a directional sense, yet without destination or definitive end. Yet as Nancy pointed out in the last publicly staged conversation that he had with Derrida, the opening, with its connotations of generosity as well as of apparition and revelation, must always be brought back, it seems to me, if one still wants to use this word, to that which is the condition of an opening, namely the contour. No doubt resonant with Derrida's notion of the trace, Nancy's contour, literally a turning together or turning with, is a question of being in common as the praxis of being with the outside. Of course, with the word contour, Nancy is also deliberately conjuring up the shape of forms and figures, and in particular, the aesthetic praxis of drawing. In doing so, he is returning to the language of contour and figuration that he has relied upon throughout his work, most especially in a series of essays from the early 1990s, and more recently, in the catalog text that accompanied the exhibition that he curated in 2009 on the pleasure of drawing. In this language of the contour and outline, Nancy finds a way to describe both the spacing of exteriority that is shared in the separation between us, and the praxis of tracing that spacing of shared separation. For according to Nancy, such a practice, quote, would trace the form of being toward in being together, without identifying the traits of the toward what or toward whom, without identifying or verifying the to what end of the sense of being in common. Of being in common, it would operate a transitivity, not a substantiality. But still there would remain something of the figure, something of the contour. It is based upon these recurring references to the tracing of outlines, contours, and figures as the non-teleological directional sense and meaning of being together, that being in common is for Nancy as much an aesthetic proposition and a question of aesthetic praxis as it is an ethical and political question and praxis. To the precise extent that being with is always a matter of tracing and retracing, not the end, but the edge that the spacing of the common is. Indeed, In the final section of his seminal essay, La Comparaison, the Comparing, from the existence of communism to the community of existence, Massey acknowledges that, quote, figuration itself cannot simply be condemned. It too is part of the structure, that is, the structure of being in common. As he goes on to say, the crucial double question of the in common would thus be how to exclude without fixing, figure, and how to fix without excluding. In a philosophical ontology of being with and being with the outside, why the retention here of the terms exclude and fix, which would seem to be antithetical to such a philosophy? The reason, of course, is that, as Massey states, quote, community, in its organic or mystical conception, that is essentially in its known philosophical and political forms, always excludes on principle. Such exclusion, always excludes and on principle. Such exclusion can be named distinction, exile, banishment, sacrifice, disdain, marginality, selection, election, roots, and so on. And we heard quite a bit about that in Tom Mitchell's talk this afternoon. And in excluding, exclusion also names, identifies, and designates, right? And there we're playing with the etymology of drawing and design, in which the latter term designates is to be understood in a literal sense as that which draws, designs, fixes the lines by which identity is fixated upon and stigmatized. We call that which is excluded and fixed the other. And this brings us to perhaps an even deeper reason as to why we cannot think community apart from exclusion and fixation. That is because, as Massey argues, this other is nothing other than the in, that prefix. If the in of the in-between forms the intimate doubleness or sharing of the association, dissociation, where association, that is, being with, is formed. Thus, when Massey states, and I repeat, the crucial double question of the in common would thus be how to exclude without fixing, and how to fix without excluding. He is asking about a form of praxis that would draw the contours of being with in such a way that the outside is the spacing of the in of in between. The outline is that line that traces the non-figurable contour of the outside and of the in-between as the outside's innermost edge. To further draw from Massey's language, we might say that the outline upholds the lines of exteriority, which sort of fixes them, without excluding, while at the same time, as the trace of the outside's innermost edge, the outline designates, quote, the absence of grounding or of presupposition, and thus excludes without fixing. Therein lies the outline's own intimate doubleness. To exclude without fixing, and to fix without excluding, is not to turn the spacing of relationality into an end, but rather to outline its edge. In doing so, the outline draws what we might describe as figures of the outside, that are not so much figures of the edge, representations of the edge, but figures on the edge of figuration, edge figures, if you will. The edge is the innermost, and thus we might say, most intimate spacing of exteriority. The edge is neither the outer border of an absolute interiority, nor the inner lining of an absolute exteriority, but instead is the source and sense of the intimacy of the outside, not beyond. not beyond, because as Massey has said, in its very tracing of this exteriority, the contour is the condition of an opening, such that we are led to conceive of the outlined edge as the only ground of being in common. If we were to learn how to trace these edges, and Massey argues that we certainly need to learn, then as he also argues, this can never simply be a matter for, say, political economists or those committed to righting political economic wrongs. For when the political is no longer made to be a question of ends, but of unmanageable edges, then it is through various forms of edge praxis, forms of praxis that include, but as we shall see, are not limited to drawing and writing. It is through such various forms of edge praxis that we stand the chance of reconfiguring the common by tracing the edges of the common. The sense, in the sense of aesthesis and experience of the common, lies in the pleasures and the risks of our shared affinities to these contiguous and contagious edges that are opened up just between us, along the edges of our bodies, with other bodies and other places and things. These frayed, edged affinities trace what Massey has referred to as an ellipse of the common. In my paper today, divided into two sections, I consider works by two contemporary artists in which a praxis of drawing traces the infinite finitude of the edge as this ellipse of the common, its tense, tension, and extension. As the drawn contours and outlines of bodies and things, faces and architectural surfaces, these edges become a way to conceive of an erotic aesthesis of the common. Bodies that are at times more incorporeal than corporeal, places that take place in passing, techniques that are as much inoperative as they are productive, less so identifiable subjects, and more so impersonal or anonymous singularities. These edge figures, spaces, and techniques are the where and the how by which appearing and disappearing, becoming and unbecoming persist as the immeasurably infinite relations that they are, and through which our compearance happens. Moving across principally two different valences of the edge of the body and of architecture. In part one, I discuss the masturbatory practice of edging and its relation to various iterations of Francisco Fernando Granados's work, Spatial Profiling, a public drawing performance executed on the walls of a gallery or museum. Arguing for masturbation in general and masturbatory edging in particular as an exteriorizing of the self, I read Granados's work as a move away from the inscriptive enunciation of my body toward a non-phenomenological erotics of any body. In part two, I discuss Sarah Cabot's drawing installation, Half by Half, and her delineation with vinyl tape of the outline of every line in a pair of men's and women's bathrooms. By tracing the edges of things, Cabot's work further moves the erotic aesthesis of edging into minor architectural spaces where the question of the common lies in the transiting between the ambiguities of any body and no body. Okay, so part one, edging, profile, and drawing the self out of self from my body to any body. And this first section, edge, pleasure, and the abandonment of edge. So before I get to Granados's work, there's this sort of extended excursus on masturbatory edging. Within the catalog of sex, edging, otherwise known as peeking or surfing, is the masturbatory practice of repeatedly bringing the sexually aroused body right up to the edge of orgasm without actually reaching and achieving orgasm. Edging is a kind of perverse sustaining of a desirous rapport with and on the very verge of sexual satisfaction, fulfillment, and consummation. By turning our attention to edging, I want to suggest that in the pleasure that it derives from its passionate abandonment of orgasmic climax, edging also might offer us a lesson, one that extends beyond the realm of sex and sexual desire. A lesson about the value of a sustained refusal of ends, and the pleasure that might be derived from discovering that what one thought was and or the end is an edge. Whereas Freud recognized and located a certain sensuality in forepleasure, Vorlust, he never relented from insisting that orgasmic end pleasure, Endlust, was the normative telos, and thus non-pathological trajectory and endpoint of sexual pleasure. We might say that for Freud, the real point of sex was the end. Indeed, as Nancy states, quote, "It goes without saying that for him, Freud, the purposiveness, the finality of terminal pleasure largely dominates the whole of his theory of sexuality, and that in general, Freudian pleasure has an end, in other words, a goal, an end term. That would be discharge or relaxation." End of quote. No doubt, given the schema, Freud would have relegated edging to the masturbatory depths of sexual underdevelopment, since the pleasure that edging derives from refusing end pleasure can be said to conflate edge pleasure with fore pleasure. If we can speak in this way, we might say that edging, as the pleasurable extension of sexual tension, is at once the outer spatial temporal edge of fore pleasure and the inner spatial temporal edge of end pleasure. Edging is what might be described as a counterfeit pleasure in the sort of in a Foucauldian sense, one that gains part of its political currency by being liberated from the instrumental productive and reproductive uses of pleasure that coalesce as hegemonic forms of sex and sexuality. In this way, perhaps it is not unlike a number of other practices of bodily pleasure, such as fake orgasm, which, as Anna-Marie Chagos has recently argued, quote, "In failing to be legible as productive, fake orgasm intervenes in the presumption that to register as political, sexual practices must be keyed to productive action, must move things along and make stuff happen," end of quote. But we might go farther and argue that edging is even more counterfeit, and thus perhaps even more political, in that unlike fake orgasm, in which orgasm does not actually happen, but nonetheless one's sexual partner or partners is or are made to think that it has for you, edging is the pleasure of the absence of orgasm, and thus outside of the restricted economy of authenticity and artificiality, the real and the fake, the normative and the truth, in other words, a sexual economy, of which fake orgasm is wholly operative and a part. While Chagos points out the way in which, quote, "the reiterative performance of fake orgasm trains the body against orgasm proper, and thus is, at least psychoanalytically speaking, a psychosomatic problem similar to edging, the ecstatic erotic ascesis that is edging even further occupies this so-called pathological space, only to further resist and disrupt it, by refusing the teleological economy of orgasm, real or fake, altogether. Edging is erotic ascesis through excess, and erotic excess via ascesis. Edging is not a substitute for orgasm, but is instead the exploration, either alone or with others, of the intense extension and reiteration of bodily erotic pleasure, divested of the teleological desire for climax and completion. Which is also to say that edging offers us a sense of desire as other than a desire for teleology. In a way, it seems as though for Gigots, a faked orgasm is better than no orgasm at all. Such as when she argues that fake orgasm gains its political valence and potential from its disappointing negativity. As she writes, stymied yet resourceful, persistent, almost to the point of anachronism, fake orgasm can be thought political to the degree that it indexes a future lived strenuously as a disappointing repetition of the present. End of quote. In this statement, we might think we recognize certain traits shared between fake orgasm and edging, both of which might be described as stymied yet resourceful, persistent, almost to the point of anachronism. Yet edging requires us to rewrite the latter half of the quotation, the part about indexing a future lived strenuously as a disappointing present. For if edging can be thought political, it is to the degree that it indexes a future lived persistently as a nascent opening up again at the limit, end, and point of no return, and not as a disappointing repetition of the present. This in turn requires a thinking of the political as the holding open of the possibility of turning back, and of things not having gone so far that they cannot be undone. I mean, without this notion of the political, like what's happening in the US right now, I mean, it just would give you like a kind of chronic perpetual, it's just, there has to be the sense that, right, that is the political sense, that it can always be undone. This is one of the things meant, I think, by Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lagarde, but by their notion of retreating the political, this famous phrase that they organized collective research around in the early 80s. Namely, that the rearticulation and retracing of the political at times requires the retreat of, but not from, the political, from politics, including in its teleological demand for political ends. Instead of the cruel optimism of fake orgasm, edging is the pleasurable reiteration of a retreating and exceeding optimism. Rather than implicitly stating that I would rather have a real orgasm but will settle for a fake one, as Gigots describes the inner monologue of the orgasm faker, the body, figure, and praxis of edging says that it would prefer not to come, as though remaining in some Bartleby-inspired autoerotic loop of neither wanting to nor not wanting to, but of preferring not to come, and experiencing pleasure through a non-simulating form of erotic stimulation that exceeds the dialectic of positivity and negativity. It is in this way that edging retreats from and exceeds the phenomenological limits of orgasmology. That's both, I think, the study of orgasm, it is certainly the title of Gigots' book. For the source of pleasure that is edge pleasure is the pleasure of resisting and refusing normative satisfaction, in the sense of a satiating end. Edging undoes at least two of the mytho-economies of orgasmic finitude, namely the mini-death and the happy ending. But there's more. As a pleasure of the edge, edging is also the overflowing rhythmic abandonment of ends. Edge pleasure is the pleasure of exceeding the limit of what typically corresponds with satisfaction. In a sense, within the restricted economy of sexuality, pleasure is always counterfeit because it derives its sense from always being on the edge or verge of satisfaction. That's how we can define pleasure. Quoting Nancy, we might say the edging and the edge pleasure of which it is an exemplary case abides by, quote, the supreme rule not to be satisfied with anything, and to measure its pleasure by the desire not to be satisfied. And for Nancy, this is how aesthetics is an ethics. That is, by not, quote, becoming fixated on a good, instead of thinking what exceeds such exclusion. At the same time, what Nancy refers to as the originary ethics of aesthetics, so moving from ethics to aesthetics, lies in, quote, a desire to be pleased by a thing that is not limited to the completion of an appearance, a signification, or a destination. So along with nonsense for things, one, that it is the end that displeases. Two, that the ethical is a comportment to the unfinishable. Three, that the tracing of the edge is its aesthetic measure. And four, that edging is one of the gestural pleasures of this ethical aesthesis. With edging, masturbation finds its end in itself. That is, in the prolonged extending and sustaining of the finite edge, verge, or eve of orgasm. Edging consummates itself in not ending, by consuming, expending, and wasting any ending. Without a rest, it has no result, and it never stops beginning, and it never stops finishing. Edging is not the bad infinite of some frustratingly frenzied masturbatory anticipation, but the good infinite, or actual infinity, that Massey defines as infinity in the actuality of the act itself, insofar it is the act of exceeding itself. Yet in this regard, edging would be for Massey equivalent to any form of sex, given that, as it goes on to state, quote, sex essentially exceeds itself, which is why it is essentially exciting. However, the ways in which edging exceeds itself makes it distinct from other forms of sex, and this essential difference involves the relation between edging and time. But before I go there, allow me to insert here a few comments on a certain privileging of teleological fulfillment in the forms of aesthetic catharsis and orgasmic discharge, and the pathologizing of aesthetic or sexual experiences that are intensely pleasurable and yet are either without climactic culmination or persist in the latter's indefinite postponement. I am referring to arguments made by Franco Berardi in his recent book entitled And Phenomenology of the End. In a chapter entitled The Sensitive Infosphere, in which, as he describes it, corporeal and aesthetic sensibility is thrown into a vertigo of simulated and unfulfilled stimulation by an intensification and acceleration of electronic signals, right, a kind of pornographic deluge. Berardi isolates and rails against pornography and pornographic media as some of the chief culprits in the shrinking and anesthetizing of collective sensibility. And of course we know, I mean, if you read Rossier, sometimes even Massey and others, many of these otherwise taken to be radical continental thinkers are really not down on pornography. For instance, at one point, Bifo writes, quote, introducing an inorganic item in the circle of excitement and pleasure, for instance, electronic stimulation, or accelerating the intensity and frequency of the stimuli, will result in a contraction of the psychophysical time of reaction and a spasm, get this language, a spasm of unfinished excitement will replace orgasmic discharge. Seemingly unable to envision that there could be excitement in the unfinished, it is clear that Berardi cannot fathom how something like edging might result in the extension and not the contraction of the psychophysical time of reaction by taking such temporal extension as its own source of overflowing, although not climactic fulfillment. Edging, including, and this is important, the pornography and pharmacology that are at times important components of it, edging is not the, in his words, abstraction of time from sensuousness, but the sensuous extension and rhythmic syncopation and abandonment of time in time. Berardi consistently renders pathological, and even more specifically in his terms, chronopathological, the kinds of hyperstimulating and repetitive without end forms of sexual and erotic edge pleasure, and the bodies, the images, the screens, and porno prosthetic devices that constitute this general economy of excess pleasure. Edging is an intensifying repetition of masturbatory rhythm, in which both masturbation and all other forms of rhythm are less modes of returning to a self or a center than they are syncopated edges. In other words, rhythmic interruptions of ends. This rhythmic syncopation is not simply an extending of temporality. It is the extension that is the timing or edging of time itself. The being of time as always the becoming of time, and the becoming of time as always the time to come, such that time, its timing and rhythm, might be thought of as edging. Perhaps that would also then lead us to suggest that any rapport to time or with time, including to time as nothing but the temporal rapport to time's own syncopated rhythm, is edging. Including, that is, in edging's rhythmic abandonment of time. For what we're dealing with here is something like what Massey described when he wrote of, quote, the time that never suspends its flight. The time of abandonment is the time, the wavering, or we could say the edging, of the instantly abandoned instant. Time abandons itself. And that is its definition, time abandoning itself. And in time, we are abandoned to time, just as time abandons us. This speaks not only to a rhythmic rapport with time, but to the rhythmic rapport that time is. It is the infinite extension and syncopation of time's finitude, of which edging is one technique, praxis, and pleasurable form of rapport. So, edging in time. Just as much as one jerks off in time, when being edged, it is as though one is jerking off time with time, as though time were a sex toy. Chronopornography, that is not, as I have argued, contra bifo, the symptom of a chronopathology. Edging withdraws time from the chronological course of events, from destiny, and from its end, which in a sense is the freeing of time, in excess of time as temporal teleology or historical necessity. This might also be a way to conceive of the relation between time and freedom. In all of this discussion, a distinction needs to be maintained between edging and, in fact, masturbation in general. But of course, what does in general mean here? And that particularly excessive and wasteful form that goes by, or at least went by, the name onanism. Such that in not focusing on orgasm, we are also moving from a restricted to a general economy of bodies and pleasures, as I have argued, that is something other than a Derridian-inspired dissemination. In other words, edging is a form of erotic excess and a wasting of time that lies not in the broadcasting of seed, semen, sperm, or other sexual fluids, but in overflowing again and again the edge that otherwise might come to constitute itself as an orgasmic and disseminated end. In its incessant retreat from orgasm, edging is the retreating within masturbation that nonetheless sustains a masturbatory rhythmic abandonment of the outside. Edging thus exceeds the temporality of to come by rendering the end of coming unbecoming. The pleasure of edging's rhythmic abandonment is opposite any notion of masturbation as a retreating or withdrawing of the self into the self. We might say that edging is a non-orgasmic, yet non-negative, emptying out of the sexual subject, self, and substance, ironically by not emptying, spilling, or spurting orgasmic sexual substance. Okay, now we're moving towards Francisco's work. In a chapter of their book, Being Nude, the Skin of Images, chapter entitled Disfiguration, Jean-Luc Nancy and Federico Ferrari state that, quote, the real, including what we might call the corporeal real here, is never given. The real is never given, the real is realized. Painting, they say, is precisely the praxis at the heart of which the real realizes itself. by becoming a figure exposed to time, to the excesses of time, end of quote. What they say about painting can equally, if not more so, be said of drawing, and within the context of our discussion of edging. For what I've been trying to suggest is that the gestural pleasure of edging generates a figure exposed to the excesses of time in the form of something like an outline. In doing so, the corporeal reality of a body is realized in and as an exorbitant corporeal extremity. A body meaning a figure always on the edge of the self, which is also to say, as the authors go on to note, this suspension or extension of pleasure's proper fixity is impassibility. Its impassibility is also how the figure exposes itself to the continual disfiguration of itself, to the continual exceeding of the body in relation to the self that is the body's self. In other words, edging is a rhythmic gestural pleasure that traces the non-figurable contour of a body, its outlined exposure to the outside. Edging is something like a compulsive scribbling, scrawling, or doodling of a body, something like the kind of drawing that is often inscribed on the margins or edges of paper and other surfaces. Of course, the relation between such pleasurable erotic exscription goes the other way as well, right, from drawing to edging, as in the story told by Giorgio Vasari of the young Michelangelo furtively indulging in the pleasure of drawing and being scolded by his elders for doing so. As Nancy puts it, the fever of drawing, the fever of art in general, is born of the frenzied desire to push form right to the limit, to make contact with the formless, as an erotic fever pushes bodies to the limits of their forms. So edging draws the self out of self. And what is left is not so much even a body, but its contour, its outline. Yet perhaps this is always the work, poiesis, or praxis of the self. This is what the self means. This is what the self does. The self outlines itself, becoming itself by tracing the exteriority from out of which its contour can be outlined, that condition, right, of the opening. This spacing of being with as being without is the spacing of the common, and the tracing of this outline is, I want to argue, an erotic aesthesis of the common. In his work titled Spatial Profiling, and the title includes that ellipsis, Francisco Fernando Granados performs for us the scene of drawing as the scene of edging, and vice versa, right? The scene of edging is the scene of drawing. That intimate doubleness. In his description of the work, Granados states, spatial profiling is a durational performance and site-specific drawing project. The action consists of a continuous tracing of the outline of my profile as I move along the contours of a given space. Drawn directly on the wall, the trace of the action forms a pattern that indicates the passing of the outermost edges of the body through a process that pushes past the boundaries of the identifiable, and as I want to argue, beyond the boundaries of the self. Through the durational, rhythmically repetitive tracing of the outline of his face, his profile, Granados exceeds, again and again, the innermost edges of the outside by passing, again and again, over the outermost edges of the body, his body. Like a snail or caterpillar inching its way across the surface of the wall, the artist's body has been dissociated from itself, leaving only a trace of itself at each point in the space traversed. Like the Francis Bacon painting, Study for a Nude of 1951, that is the exemplary image for Nancy and Ferrari's discussion of disfiguration, Granados' drawing is, to quote the authors, figurative insofar as it shows the movement of a body, a movement that a body completes in order to become a figure. quoting them further in order to draw further out the resonance between their description of Bacon's painting praxis and Granados' performative inscription, we can say that Granados' profiling, quote, through his profiling, gesture is skinned, stripped of all narrative, anatomical, classificatory, semantic, symbolic, or sanctifying intent. Through this anonymous or impersonal aesthetics, Granados' work calls our attention to, as it simultaneously disrupts, such excluding and fixing representational logics as those operative in racial, say, facial profiling. With their faces brutally pressed against walls, or more often the hoods, trunks, and doors of police cars, black bodies are made to fit the already inscribed contours of racist identification and its own narrative, anatomical, classificatory, semantic, and symbolic intent. And so Francisco will tell you that during the performance, as he's drawing his profile again and again, his arm and shoulder will start to fatigue. And in order to stretch it out and release some of that tension and some of that fatigue, he will extend that arm over his head or down below. And that's what creates these extended arcs above and below the sort of landscape horizon that he's creating through his facial profile. Okay, part two. How am I doing for, oh boy, okay. Okay, I'll try to. In a special issue of the journal Critical Inquiry, on the topic of intimacy, Candace Vogler published an article entitled Sex and Talk. It's about the pleasures of losing track of oneself, including by talking about one's inner experiences, yet in a way that is not part of an attempt to secure a sense of self, whether through the discourse of self-expression or by overstepping the bounds of reason and will of the self and claiming or appropriating what she describes as a region of human life that does not belong to personhood. Just as much as it is not about a hyperbolic expressing of the self. Such talk is also not about violent self-abolition, self-sacrifice, or the anxious disavowal of the self. As Vogler characterizes them, these two poles, the hyperbolic and the abolishing, represent what she refers to as the self-exclamatory seesaw, it's me, versus there's no me there or here. Instead, in Vogler's example or case of women's talk, and specifically troubles talk, the kind of talk that she's seeing women sort of perform together when they're kind of complaining about their partners and their sex lives, we are introduced to a kind of intimacy that, as she describes it, allows one to forget who one is for a little while, to feel like the most personal things do not mark one off as unique, and to that extent alone in all the world. Such, what she describes as timely self-forgetfulness, through talk is also then, as she argues, something like sex. Like sex, and in particular that which is not wholly defined in terms of orgasmic climax. The purposelessness of such talk does not necessarily serve any purpose or end, and in this regard, in its lament, does not represent the end of relationality or sociability, but rather the possibility of a sense of being with and in common. So, as Vogler concludes, by cultivating not just the pleasures of self-expression or self-abolition or self-disavowal, a space might open up for a reading, now there's Candace, for reading a larger world writ into an intimate scene, and perhaps from there for imagining a kind of intimate engagement with the larger world as something neither hostile to nor affirming one's own most sense of self. I think that what Vogler is pointing to here is a form of intimacy in which a sense of self is always at the same time a sense of the common. In Vogler, I find intimations of what I have been calling a shared intimacy with the outside, not beyond, as a way of redefining what we mean by intimacy and the common, that doubleness. And in fact, in an essay by Tom Mitchell entitled Abstraction and Intimacy, he makes this very point that intimacy always means collectivity. I use the phrase not beyond in the sense of this intimacy being not sublime or transcendent in its exposure to the outside. Instead, it is a spacing that is neither claimed by or for the self, nor is inhabited by the other, but that properly belongs to no one, at least nobody in particular. In her reading of Adrienne Rich's poem entitled Dialogue, and the women's talk, troubles talk that it poetically presents, Vogler finds a positive alternative to intimacy as fashioned either in terms of self-expression or depersonalization. However, she seems to have had a harder time finding an alternative to Leo Bersani's notion of self-shattering in what she describes as his speculative psychobiology, in which sex is always about some sublime beyond. Vogler argues that Bersani's sexual sublime finds its closest philosophical progenitor in none other than Immanuel Kant, about whom, Vogler writes, Kant thinks that sex itself offends against personhood. The appetite for it objectifies, and the pleasure of it disrupts people's sense of themselves as distinct individuals with rational wills. Given this, Vogler then proceeds to assert that, quote, the contemporary theorist closest to Kant on this subject is Leo Bersani. Now, without delving into the intricacies of Vogler's reading of Kant after Bersani, for our purposes within the context of my discussion, we can note that according to Vogler, quote, what belongs most intimately to the sexual in Bersani is a seesaw of it's me, there's no me there. In other words, for Bersani, the question is still more so one of the self than of the common. And so as Vogler asks, if the speculative biological story were true, then how could Bersani possibly use it to recommend public politics over private pleasures for anyone? I want to take this question and translate it into my own. Namely, how can one conceive of a queer sex publics in terms of an erotics of the common? I believe the answer largely lies in conceiving of the relations between aesthesis, sense, aesthetics, and erotics. And not only in terms of an aesthetics that is erotic, but of an erotics that is aesthetic, and even further, an erotic aesthesis that is not limited to self or the couple form, but bears upon a sense of the common. Now, Vogler first published her article in '98, and so her engagement with Bersani's work was primarily based upon his books such as The Freudian Body from '86, Homos '95, and his groundbreaking essay, Is the Rectum of Grave, from 1988. In other words, Vogler's essay is now 18 years old and was grounded in work that we might characterize as early Bersani. Since then, in essays such as Against Monogamy from 1998, Sociality and Sexuality, published in Critical Inquiry in 2000, Sociability and Cruising, Raritan from 2002, and the essay that I will now turn to, entitled Ardent Masturbation, parentheses, Descartes, Proust, Freud, et al., originally published in 2011, also in Critical Inquiry, and most recently in his book, Thoughts and Things. Bersani has modified and distanced himself from his earlier speculative psychobiological explanation of the source of sexuality and its ethical capacities. Instead, he's moved towards a more decidedly cosmological conception of impersonal sameness and cosmic correspondences and interrelations between our bodies and pretty much everything else in the universe. Perhaps not surprisingly, it is in contrast to this sense of expansiveness, and connection, that Bersani juxtaposes the Cartesian self and its ontological certainty and epistemological assurance. But in doing so, he also entirely equates the solitary retreat of the Cartesian cogito and its inward self-directed movement of self into self, the res cogitans, with masturbation. This is because for Bersani, the act of masturbation is wholly defined as the triumph of solipsistic desire, opposite the kind of extension or exposure of the self towards other bodies, places, and things in the world that characterizes my own definition of masturbation, and the rhythmic syncopation of the outside edge that beats at his heart and is the innermost sense of masturbation's source of pleasure. Indeed, at one point, Bersani goes so far as to say that the phrase masturbatory relationality is an oxymoron, and as such, something of a philosophical fantasy. So unlike the seesaw of, it's me, there's no me here, we might imagine that it's only me here to be the enunciation of the masturbatory self for Bersani. Of course, as you can easily imagine, this is one of the places, in fact, it's one of those relatively rare places, where Leo's thinking and my own part ways. For since my very first publications in what was then the emerging field of queer theory, my work has returned again and again to an image and to images of masturbation as a form of sex by which the self extends, exteriorizes, and exposes itself, such that even the word cum, spelled C-U-M, might be understood as signifying the wholly pleasurable erotic space-time of being with in Latin, cum. Thus, in feeling the need and having the desire to return to this work, I want to argue that the masturbating self is not a self that returns to itself, even in edging, as though in terms of an infinite relation to self, and thus perhaps should not even be referred to as a self. Rather, we might say that masturbation, like any other good form of sex, is always a rapport with the outside. And even further, that this erotic intimacy with the outside is non-appropriative, non-possessive, and without mastery. In other words, the masturbatory self is at once res cogitans, the thinking thing, and res extensa, the extended thing, yet to the precise extent that any self is an edged thing. Such was the premise for the arguments that I made about masturbation in two early essays. One on semen and other bodily fluids in medieval sculpture and contemporary painting, an essay entitled Queering Boundaries, Semen and Visual Representation from the Middle Ages and the Era of AIDS. It's a paper that I originally wrote for Tom Mitchell's Word and Image graduate seminar. I think that was 1993. It was later published in Gay and Lesbian Studies and Art History, which was edited by Whitney Davis, and it was the first such publication in the field of art history. That was in '94. The other article on dark rooms, back rooms, or jack-off rooms, AIDS and safe sex, social anonymity, and public group sex in early 1990s New York City, entitled Jacking Off in Minor Architecture. That's a paper that I originally wrote for George Teyssot's graduate seminar on de-domesticated architecture in '92. It was then published in the journal, this underground journal that kind of looked like in its appearance an academic journal, called Steam in '93. One of the primary reasons I wrote Jacking Off was because I saw the newly opened and almost nightly packed back rooms in various bars and clubs in New York City. There's one of them, the Crowbar on 10th Street in East Village back then in the early '90s, to be nothing less than the social sexual laboratories training men who have sex with men, quote, how to have promiscuity an epidemic, to appropriate Douglas Crimp's important title from his very important essay of that time. And not only how to have promiscuous sex, but also how to do so safely. Indeed, as Bersani notes in his masturbation essay, in the sex-phobic hysteria of the early years of the AIDS pandemic, there were constant calls, and we know, not just from outside the so-called gay community, to, in Bersani's terms, renounce intimate relations and to practice abstinence. As he goes on to say, if abstinence must allow for some sexual practice, that practice will, of course, be masturbation. That is, sexual self-love. Thus, gays were once again marginalized. This is his argument, his memory. When in fact, what the jack-off rooms amounted to was a radical reappropriation of the discourse of masturbation as safe sex, and its redirection away from abstinence and so-called solitary self-love and towards that which was promiscuously communalized. At exactly that time in the early 1990s, at the height of the AIDS crisis, and still at least 3 to 4 years away from the discovery and medical implementation of the so-called cocktail of AIDS drugs, that was in '96, these models and architectures of, again, non-oxymoronic masturbatory relationality were incredibly important and powerful political spaces. For by pursuing the pleasures of anonymous sex, those who opened, those who maintained, and those who congregated in these spaces at the same time refused some of the most pervasive biopolitical claims and campaigns by which AIDS was being managed or mismanaged. Jack-off rooms were not philosophical, political, or sexual fantasies, nor were they divorced or from the actual world, including the world of AIDS. This is also how Franco Bifo Berardi once again has it entirely wrong when he claims AIDS immediately led to mediated pornographic substitutes for actual physical sex. In a site-specific drawing installation first presented as her MFA thesis at Cranbrook in 2002, and then again at the Drawing Center in New York in 2009, Sarah Cabot retraced the lines of the fixtures, the tiles, appliances, and all of the other things in a pair of men's and women's bathrooms. She did this by affixing extremely narrow adhesive vinyl strips to all of the surfaces and just 1/2 inch from the edges of each thing. In an email to me, she at one point described the work as, quote, drawing of the space on the space, which is also to say, in those 1/2 inch intervals that she creates between the pre-given and the drawn lines, which is where I want to argue the space's multiple outsides are exposed right on its surfaces along each of its edges. Cabot's work is an edging of architectural space, a way of, as she puts it, quote, using a banal object's own ubiquity against itself, undermining its function and its aesthetics. Such a tactic, of course, situates her work within a genealogy of modern art inaugurated by Marcel Duchamp's invention of the ready-made. And this is all the more germane here, given that Duchamp's most famous ready-made is the men's urinal that he turned on its side, signed Armat, and renamed Fountain. The perverse, obscene, and potentially erotic sexual dimension of Duchamp's radically trans gesture should never be ignored. And in the context of my discussion, it is particularly germane since it is precisely this kind of rendering inoperative of a banal object or an everyday place's function and aesthetics that is, for the purposes of relatively clandestine erotic pleasure and sexual encounter, that is one of the distinguishing features of cruising and public sex. Yet this too is not only a question of erotics and sex, but also about aesthetics, and even further of the ways in which they are cooperative in what I referred to in earlier work as the logic of the lure. Cruising conjoins two tendencies cast as opposite by Kant, a radically impersonal sexual appetite and an attention to specific qualities and details in others and in the spaces and places where the anonymous encounters take place. In her public bathroom installation, Cabot draws for us this scene of pornographic attention to the ordinary and largely imperceptible surfaces and edges, and the ways in which this attention to the mere appearance of things and places and bodies is in fact always a co-appearance, that is, a co-participating in the space of emergence or eclosure, of opening. What we're talking about here are the contiguous partitions, the proximate toilet fixtures, the creak of a door opening and closing, the shadow cast on the floor, the formless shape reflected in the polished tile. Like Cabot's retracing of the bathroom's edge space, these non-figural contours and gestures mimetically make the space resonate, and hence open up a space that is as much aesthetic as it is erotic, and vice versa. Here we follow, no, I'm going to skip that part and go straight to my conclusion. In an essay titled A Sense of the Common, William Haver puts forth 5 points. 1, that the common is always the sense of the common, and the common is always the sensuousness of the common. 2, that the sense of the common is itself sensuous. 3, that the common is a transcendental object in the Kantian sense of an a priori intuition that is the condition of possibility for all radical knowledge. 4, that this aesthetic sense of the common is, in fact, in tension with point number 3, is an impossible transcendental object precisely because the intuition of the common is not the sheer receptivity of an essentially passive subject. It is an active intuition of the common, one that happens through a mutual appropriation, right, which I'm equating with cruising, or co-appropriation, or what I've been describing as a co-aesthetic erotic resonance. Finally, 5th point, this mutual appropriation as the active intuition of the common is passionate and aesthetic, as well as wholly opportunistic. Opportunistic in the sense of being without any general plan or model, any logical or moral principle of action. What I think we have here in Haver's 5-point definition of the sense of the common is a philosophical articulation of cruising as an active intuition of the common. As Haver goes on to conclude, there could be no question of the common apart from the aesthetic determination of partisans in their trajectories toward the singularity of their disappearance, which is to say, in the impossibility of a sense of the common. Accordingly, if there were no question of the common, including in the impossibility of a sense of the common, there would also be no question, that is, meaning no possibility of the erotic, of pleasure, of cruising, but also of multiplicity, ambiguity, singularity, the indeterminate, the empirical, the ethical, the pornographic, and intimacy. The art of the consummate cruise is that which is without end, or that which exceeds any sense of an ending, but instead remains in its anonymity, promiscuity, and the itinerancy of its departure and abandonment, always on the verge or edge of coming. The common, as the spacing of singularities in their shared separation and in their exposure to the outside, is the edge of which all singularities remain exposed on this side outlined as the edge and contour of our shared finitude. To reconfigure the public sphere is to reimagine the space of the common not as public in opposition to private, nor as a sphere, but as an infinitely exposed and extended edge. In alliance with Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, I argue that this is no longer even a question of a politics of the common and its resistance to enclosure, given that this is its own politics of the end, such a politics of the common. Instead, what I've been trying to suggest is a thinking toward an aesthetics, aesthesis, or sense of the common that in the passionate abandonment of ends retreats into the external world, to quote Adrian Piper, through an erotically shared intimacy with the outside, such that the edge is the spacing of the common. Trans is the prefix for actions, techniques, and forms of praxis that fix without excluding and exclude without fixing. Edging and drawing are two trans words for the praxis of infinishing our finitude in common. That is, keeping open the outside that lies no place other than just between us. Thank you.
Testing. So thank you so much, Professor Ricco. We have 20 minutes for questions, and I'm just going to start with a quick one. I'm going to cite the user CumControl101 from the site Xtube, if you know him. And in his videos, I think he figures edging as a concept which always holds in, so to speak, or holds in itself two sinister repurposabilities, two ways of being repurposed toward teleology. And the first way is when the edger uses edging as a way to intensify the orgasm. And so the edger himself is aiming toward a teleology of the orgasm that's even stronger than normal sex, so to speak. And in the second way that it's sinisterly repurposable is when the edgy accidentally comes during sex, and the edgy's body sort of without his will being a part of it, unconsciously activates the teleology of the orgasm. And I'm wondering if these two ways that edging can be used, how do they interact with your current theory or concept of the edge?
Right, whether they lie within it or whether they're sort of opposites.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think it. I mean, maybe I should make it clear that one of the things I think I'm saying about edging is that it's not anti-orgasm, which in fact is Anna Marie Jagoz's misreading of my earlier work, in which, you know, the first note of the book is John Paul Ricco is against orgasm. Well, au contraire. I mean, the problem isn't, you know, that's. But there is a way in which, if you start to instrumentalize edging and make it the means by which you're going to, by delaying orgasm, intensify the orgasm once it happens. I mean, I don't see those two things as incompatible or as the result sort of negating, you know, the import and the power of edging. Maybe in fact confirming that if edging is an erotic relation of excess and extension and exposure and so forth, then there's a way in which precisely through the process there's always the potential that, you know, what you're also going to get is you're going to get an excessive orgasm, right? You're going to, and I think the potential for that bears upon the second point that this person is making about, you know, the surprise, the accidental, the sort of coming before you want, or before you think you're going to. And so I think, you know, the point is that edging is playing with those, erotically kind of extending and playing and rhythmically kind of, right? And that's why I think it's a way of saying, you know, not that there aren't ends, not that there isn't a telos, not that that doesn't happen, but that there's a way to kind of pleasurably deconstruct the end. You know, I mean, that's all this really is that, and that is called edging, right? It's like, what happens when you deconstruct an end? You turn it into an edge. You realize, oh, that thing that you thought was a finality is actually an opening. That's deconstruction. That's I mean, you know, that's literally what he was kind of calling our attention to. I just want to then read a kind of erotics out of that and say that there's a way in which, you know, and edging is maybe just one of the ways to do that, but one of the examples of that. But so it's certainly not. It's so that there's a way in which it's in that kind of playing with the finite, you know, and kind of approaching it and pulling back from it to kind of deconstruct it, to render it in Nancy's terms infinite finitude, actual finitude. That is the fact that, you know, our sense of the infinite is completely conditioned by the fact of our finite being. Like that's the basis or condition of our sense of it. It's the only basis for any sense of it. And erotics and sexual pleasure has often been understood as our first intimation of the infinite. And so, in that regard, it's not the negation of the end, it's not anti-counter end, it's how to play with that, how to kind of approach it and retreat from it. But not in a way that's, again, anticipatory, not in a way that's just a tease, not in a way that's simply play, but that really attempts to try to undo that kind of finality, and tries to sustain that sort of rapport. But of course, finitude, whether we're talking about an orgasm or existence, I mean, you can't avoid it. Like, you're going to die, you're going to come. It's like, it's just that. But that's not the point. The point isn't to transcend finitude. The point is to kind of, edge it. Edge finitude.
Thank you.
That's the motto.
Okay. Okay, please.
Thank you so much, John. It takes me back to some wonderful days in my
Tom is
summer.
thinking nothing of the changes.
I had two questions that I'm not clear how they're related, but they're fairly simple. One is, I was once writing about the birth of drawing. The old legend of the birth of drawing is, of course, about the man leaving, the woman inventing drawing as a way of preserving her lover. And I remember vividly arguing that, of course, she wants to remember this lost lover, and Slavoj Žižek immediately corrected me, said, no, she wants her lover to leave so that she can masturbate in front of his image, which convinced me thoroughly. I think he was right about that. So I wonder if that scene and that reading would be part of your account of drawing and the edge here, because it's a profile drawing, just like the ones you've shown. But the other question is about the commons and the question of expenditure. And I kept thinking about Negri's essay in praise of the commons, which at a certain moment he moves away from any spatial notion or even a social notion of the commons and begins to talk about money. And since you brought up the idea of the economy of sex, I kept wondering, is there a way to take your argument and think about it in relation to economy in the literal sense, not in the sense of the common currency that we all rely on, symbolic capital, and its relation to something called capitalism.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good. So the myth of Butades is the myth of the lover that traces the lover's profile before at the point of departure, just before leaving, and I guess what I'm saying is that is a wholly erotic and aesthetic moment, and that it is very much predicated upon the departure, disappearance of the other, and as you know, I mean, I've been sort of insisting upon the erotics of departure and disappearance and abandonment and leaving. It's just that's, and partly probably because early on I came across this statement by Foucault when he said, it's become quite famous, now I'm going to botch the quote, but the most exciting moment, the most kind of erotic moment is when the lover leaves in a taxi. It's like this, that there's a, I want to say that for certain social sexual subjects, there's a relationship to loss, abandonment, departure, exiting, leaving disappearance and so forth, that is not a source of anxiety and trauma, but is in fact a source of pleasure and desire, and that can certainly be a way in which we might explain how lots and lots of guys in cities in North America, certainly at the height or the midst, or however you want to kind of characterize the AIDS crisis, with many of their friends and lovers and so forth dying around them, could still do what Douglas Cook described as promiscuity in the midst of an epidemic. It's like, that there's a way in which there's a relationship there between desire and pleasure and erotics, which is not an eroticizing of death. It's simply a way, a kind of comportment to that sort of disappearance, that I think is incredibly profound and could be understood as a kind of survival tactic, as a way of not overcoming the loss, but figuring out a way to sort of stand in it, And as you know, that was the basis of the Disappeared show. It was just this sort of brutal kind of confrontation with the fact that, something is no longer here, and yet we sort of have to testify and witness to that fact and find a kind of aesthetics for that would kind of lay claim to that very fact of, wow, look at the devastation. So of course it falls into a larger aesthetic political argument about, indeed finding a way to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz or something, to be able to sort of still say something. As you said this afternoon, right? At a moment of how do we want to characterize that disaster, art is still a way. And so I'm saying that, if you're not making art, maybe you're masturbating. No, I'm not saying, but that there's still pleasure. There are other ways, and I think that relationship between art, through aesthesis and pleasure and sense disinterest is really a way to then think about, well, how do we constitute a common that is being destroyed politically and otherwise from internal and external forces, with community, often in the name of community. So how do we do that? And then the second point is about, so now I lost it.
Money.
Oh yeah, about money. So the one thing I would say about that is
the money shot.
So what there I just rely upon certain it's not Negri, it's actually Massey again, surprise, who taking on this Marxist notion of general equivalence, of which for him it's money, and it still is money. It's sort of flattening, it's common denominator. That there would then be a way that we would need to, in order to counter that kind of common currency, that reduction of everything to the restricted economy of money, we would have to think rigorously about a kind of what Nancy calls a common inequivalence or an incommensurability, and that is what we most share in common. That there is that the common is to think the common rigorously is to think the common as lacking any common measure or any common ground or any common principle by which it could be measured politically, ethically, and so forth. So to be without that would be, and so I guess in that regard, to the extent that things like art and sex, don't have a common kind of, no matter what Kant wanted to say about art, it doesn't have this sort of universal kind of means by which we access rationally, kind of, then they really remain ways in which we can avail ourselves of that fact that, in the end, the relationship between any two things is immeasurable. There's no real kind of common measure by which to reduce everything to one common currency. And I guess, to translate it into an even more kind of vulgar, it would just be, everyone has their own orgasm. Christine?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
John, can you take us back one slide to cabinet? Do you know if she cleaned or sanitized the washrooms
Yes.
before she edged them?
Yes, yeah, very good question. Christine had this, and I have shared this thing about cleanliness. Yes, so she said that she went in there and thoroughly, so part of the process, part of the project was to go into these bathrooms and thoroughly clean and sanitize them. And I think there are a couple of things to say about that. One, very practical, technical. She said, you know, the surfaces had to be immaculate for this adhesive vinyl to stick, right? She did not, for either of these installations, apply that adhesive to the floor tiles. Because at the time, there was not the kind of material available that would endure the kind of traffic and the kind of, you know, she just didn't want it to get torn up and muddy and, you know, and such, right? So the floor was not etched and drawn, but everything else was. The other thing to say is there's something about, which I didn't really, you know, kind of exploit in any way. I didn't even is the way in which through both the cleaning of the space and her drawing edging of it, she's also calling our attention to and thinking about the nobodies, the sort of bodies that you never see in this incredibly intimate yet public space of the people who clean the bathrooms, right? Of this invisible labor and of these invisible bodies that, you know, sure, sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't, but there's a way in which, you know, someone still has to clean these places. And I think, so part of what I was also thinking there about moving from nobody to somebody is also thinking about the, you know, degree to which he's playing with registers of the visible and the invisible, the imperceptible. I love this photo because given the distance from the surfaces, you sort of can't see the drawing, you know. It's very difficult to see her work in relation, and it's just that minor shift that she's making by moving every line, by redrawing it, retracing it half an inch, that suddenly everything just kind of is skewed a little bit. It's the same space yet drawn again, and it's that mimetic relationship that I think is really, or it enables a new way of thinking about the mimetic relation to the thing. Yeah.
But I'm also wondering about the spill, the dribble, the splats, and maybe you think about that in relation to Francisco's mark of exhaustion or these kind of spillages. So you've written on drooling and spills. So can that be pulled into this at all?
Yeah, for sure, because there's, you know, in both we're talking about a contoured line, and a contoured line is a very particular kind of line. It's not the strict, straight-edged, right? In neither of these works do you see that kind of line. She speaks about this too. She says, you know, I tried as much as possible to get that tape, that vinyl, you know, kind of level and even, kind of straight, but you can't. And so she said, I ended up, you know, really accepting that and seeing that as part of the drawn quality of the, you know. And so then there's also something there about drawing in general as in its relationship to the technical and technique, and, you know, that's not this kind of, again, it's a way of opening up that line and saying that the line is, you know, the hard-edged line is that absolute brutal end is really just a wavering opening, you know, so it's a fixing without excluding, it's an excluding without fixing, it's a kind of permeable ellipse, it's that kind of opening up right at the end, which is the, you know, it's that kind of, that's what I think is going on here. Just that kind of, yeah, just that sort of attention. It's kind of remarkable. Any other?
I think we have time for one final
One more, Glenn has a
question. I'm not sure. Do you want to choose a final question?
No.
Okay. Okay, we'll go.
So I guess riffing on this and thinking about this interesting proposal that you gave of this idea of figuration on the edge of figuration, right? Like, and thinking about when you were talking that circulates around kind of post-colonial discourse, but other discourses as well, as the dialectic between center and margin, right? And what it's like to be marginalized or not included in the center, and things like that. And thinking also about kind of colonial culture as the colonies, by definition, the margin in relationship to the empire, the imperial center. And so thinking about what are the forms of culture within a colonial environment. And I was reminded of, recently I had a conversation with somebody in the States, and somebody was wearing a Drake t-shirt. Also I said, oh, nice Drake t-shirt. And somebody asked, oh, who's Drake? And the person I was talking to said, oh, he's the Canadian Jay-Z. And then that made me think of, like, more than 100 years ago, Homer Watson was described by British critics as the Canadian constable. And so this idea of constantly, whatever forms of culture that you produce in a colony, it's by definition a counterfeit version, in the sense that it's the Canadian constable or the Canadian JC. And it seems to me that in that situation, the desire is always like, how can I be included? Like, how can I create a figure that will be recognized as a figure, a legitimate figure? And I guess my question is, in terms of your discussion, how can we imagine a kind of figure on the edge of a figure, right? That's not asserting a kind of identity, like, this is who I am, this is what Canadian culture looks like, for example. But how can we imagine that, this figure on the edge of figuration?
Yeah, this figure on the edge of figuration. I mean, so much of that depends upon, I mean, I don't know if this is actually going to address what you're asking, but I kind of feel as though it gets back to this question of purpose. That is, why one would want to do that. You know, it gets to the question of decision, right? Individual or collective, in terms of how one, and so if we follow this argument and Nancy's part in it, then you know, he's really asking about how to be together, because that's the only way in which one is, in such a way that there would be some kind of sense of rapport, but the rapport is not going to coalesce, and certainly not if it's about an edge politics or ethics, certainly not as a marginal space in relationship to a center. I mean, certainly what I'm trying to do is to, even though I didn't draw on that language, you know, really trying to move both away from a discourse of ends and a discourse of the margin, or even the border or the limit, you know. All of these things that kind of seem to be so easily appropriated back into the same kinds of, I hierarchical, vertical, dialectical power structures by which, you know, the world gets divided and partitioned. And so, yes, it's certainly not an easy task to kind of do what we're talking about here. And yet I also want to say, and this has, again, always been kind of an insistence of mine, that I feel as though I'm not speaking about some political imaginary. I'm speaking about things the way they actually happen. Maybe not everywhere, maybe not for everyone, not in all contexts and all situations, but we know it happens. And the fact that it does should provide us with a certain kind of, you know, fortitude or something, some sense of confidence in being able to make it happen more. But of course, you know, part of what even Haver is getting at with his last point about, you know, a sense of the impossibility of the common is to say that really what we're also talking about is something that will not become the ground or platform for politics, does not become a program, is incapable of being the means by which, you know, a certain kind of sovereign nationality, territory, or whatever it is we're talking about gets asserted, right? It's very different, and that's why at the end I turn to Moten and Haver to really question whether we even want to talk about politics as the politics of the common, whether we need to retreat from that politics of the common, because the politics of the common seems to be about wanting a figure of the common, wants there to be some, you know, and so we know the result of that. I don't know why we keep making that mistake. That's a bigger, you know, but nonetheless, you know, so, okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Ricco.
Thank you.